The moment she looked away, they were gone. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the vanishing, the Millbrook twins. Now relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Gloria's hand hovered over the register drawer as her eyes swept the convenience store floor. Just seconds ago, 2 teenage girls had stood right there at the counter of the Pump and Shop gas station, clutching their chips and sodas, counting out their change with careful fingers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the stifling Georgia heat of that Sunday afternoon, March 18, 1990. When Gloria turned back from bagging their snacks, the space where 15-year-old Danette and Jeanette Millbrook had stood was empty. The glass door hadn't chimed. She hadn't heard footsteps. They had simply dissolved into the thick Augusta air like morning fog burning off the Savannah River. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The twins would never be seen again. The day had begun with such ordinary grace. The Millbrook family had risen that Sunday morning in their modest apartment on Cooney Circle, a cramped but clean space where Mary Louise Sturgis worked tirelessly to raise her children. The walls were thin, the neighborhood rough around the edges, but Louise kept her home filled with the smell of Sunday cooking and the sound of children's laughter. 7 kids under one roof, Danette and Jeanette among them, fraternal twins who moved through the world like 2 halves of a whole. Church that morning had been filled with the usual hymns and fervent prayers. The family piled into the church van, the twins dressed in their Sunday best. Jeanette wore a blue pullover over a white turtleneck, paired with a beige skirt, white stockings, and white sneakers. Her shoulder-length jerry curl caught the light as she climbed aboard. Danette, slightly taller and darker-skinned than her sister, had chosen a white Mickey Mouse t-shirt for the morning. After the service, their pastor handed Louise some money for lunch, a small kindness that meant everything to a family scraping by. The twins volunteered to make the 15-minute walk to Church's Chicken on Laney Walker Boulevard. The air was warm, the sky clear. Spring was making its presence known in Augusta, Georgia, a city of 44,000 souls situated along the Savannah River. The twins walked together, their sneakers scuffing the pavement, talking about school, about friends, about the upcoming week. When they returned home with the chicken, Jeanette mentioned something to her mother. It was casual, almost an afterthought. A white van had followed them for part of the walk home. Louise glanced out the door, but the van was gone. In that moment, it seemed like nothing, just another vehicle heading in the same direction. There was no way she could have known that this detail would haunt her for decades to come. The family had recently moved from their old neighborhood in Bethlehem to this new apartment complex. It was more affordable, but it created a problem. Lucy C. Laney High School, where the twins were freshmen, sat 3 miles away. The school bus didn't service their new address. Public transportation cost money they didn't have. The girls were worried about how they would get to school, how they would manage. After lunch, Jeanette changed her church skirt and stockings for comfortable sneakers, but kept her blue pullover and white turtleneck on. Danette switched into white jeans and black shoes. They had a plan. They would walk to their godfather Ted's house on Forest Street in their old neighborhood of Bethlehem. Ted had promised them $20, enough for a week's worth of bus fare to school. It was a small errand, but to 15-year-olds worried about getting to class, it was everything. They left around 3 p.m., waving goodbye to their younger siblings. The walk would take them through familiar territory, past houses where they used to play, down streets they knew by heart. They reached Ted's house without incident. He handed them the money and some extra change for snacks. The girls thanked him and set off again, their pockets a little heavier, their spirits light. On their way back, they stopped at their cousin's place on Tin Cup Lane. They chatted for a while, catching up, laughing about small things. Then they continued their journey home, but they were hungry again. That extra change from Ted was burning a hole in their pockets. At the intersection of 12th Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard stood the Pump and Shop gas station, its neon sign promising cold drinks and snacks. They pushed through the glass door at approximately 4:30 p.m. Gloria, the clerk on duty, recognized them. She'd seen the twins before. They were polite girls, quiet, never any trouble. They selected their items carefully: chips, candy, a cold soda to share. They counted out their money at the register, exact change, and Gloria bagged their purchases. She looked away for just a moment. When she looked back, they were gone. Outside, the parking lot baked in the late afternoon sun. A few cars sat idle. Gloria had noticed a vehicle parked near the entrance earlier but couldn't recall its details. The make, the model, the color. It was just a car among many. Now it was gone too. The twins had a simple route home. It should have taken them 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they walked slowly, enjoying their snacks. Louise expected them back by early evening. As the sun began its descent, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and pink, she kept an eye on the door. Dinner was ready. The other children were hungry. Where were Danette and Jeanette? By 7 p.m., concern had crept into the household. The twins weren't the type to wander. They didn't have friends they'd sneak off to see. They were good girls, responsible girls. Louise sent her daughter Shanta, then 12 years old, to check the usual spots. Nothing. They walked the neighborhood together, calling out the twins' names. The streets grew darker. Still no sign of them. By 9 p.m., fear had taken root. Louise's hands trembled as she picked up the phone and dialed the Richmond County Sheriff's Office. Her voice shook as she explained. Her daughters were missing. They'd been gone for hours. This wasn't like them. Something was wrong. The voice on the other end was calm, almost dismissive. "Ma'am, you need to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. They're probably with friends. They'll come home." Louise tried to explain that her daughters didn't have friends they'd run off to see. They didn't stay out late. They'd only gone to get bus money. The officer repeated the policy. 24 hours. That's the rule. She hung up the phone. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. In missing persons cases, investigators know that the first 48 hours are critical. Evidence is fresh. Memories are sharp. Trails are warm. But Louise Sturgis had just been told to wait, to do nothing, to let precious hours slip away while her daughters were out there, somewhere possibly in danger. That night, Louise didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the street, praying for headlights, for footsteps, for the sound of her daughters' voices. Shanta curled up on the couch, too worried to go to bed. The other children asked questions Louise couldn't answer. Where were the twins? When would they come home? The clock struck midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. outside. Augusta slept. Inside the apartment on Cooney Circle, a mother kept vigil, counting down the hours until she could officially report what her heart already knew. Something terrible had happened to Danette and Jeanette Millbrook. The first 12 hours had been lost to bureaucracy. In a case where every minute matters, where the trail grows colder with each passing moment, 12 precious hours had evaporated into the night. And this was only the beginning of the failures that would plague the investigation into the disappearance of the Millbrook twins. Monday, March 19, 1990. 24 hours had passed. Louise Sturgis called the Richmond County Sheriff's Office again. This time, they listened. An officer agreed to come to the apartment to take a report. Louise felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone would help. Finally, the search would begin. The officer arrived and pulled out a notepad. Louise described her daughters in detail. Danette, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 130 pounds, slightly bow-legged, with a scar near her navel from a hernia operation performed shortly after birth. Jeanette, 5 feet 4 inches, 125 pounds, quieter than her sister, with the same surgical scar. Both had pierced ears. Both wore their hair in shoulder-length jerry curls. Both were last seen wearing the clothes they changed into Sunday afternoon. Louise explained everything. The walk to Ted's house, the stop at their cousin's, the trip to the gas station. She mentioned the white van from earlier that day. The officer wrote it all down. But there was a problem, several problems, actually. The officer misspelled the girl's last name as Milbrooks instead of Milbrook. He recorded Jeanette's middle name as Latressa, when it was actually Latrice. He got other details wrong too, small errors that would ripple forward through time, making it harder for law enforcement agencies to share information, harder for databases to match potential sightings. The officer told Louise that a detective would follow up. In the meantime, she should keep waiting, keep hoping. He left. The apartment felt emptier than ever. The detective didn't come that day, or the next, or the next. The critical first 48 hours. The window of time when most missing persons are found, when evidence is still fresh, when witnesses still remember details clearly, were ticking away. Louise called the sheriff's office repeatedly. She was told the detective was busy, would get to them soon. Meanwhile, the family organized their own search parties. Louise, Shanta, and friends from church printed flyers with the twins' photos and walked the neighborhoods, taping them to telephone poles and store windows. The Pump and Shop gas station became ground zero for the family's amateur investigation. Louise went back there, questioning Gloria about what she'd seen. Gloria repeated her story. The girls had come in, bought snacks, paid, and left. There had been a vehicle in the parking lot, but she couldn't describe it. It was just a car, or maybe a van. She couldn't be sure. Louise walked the route her daughters should have taken home, 2 miles from the gas station to their apartment. She studied every alley, every side street, every abandoned lot. Nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped bags, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. By Wednesday, 72 hours after the disappearance, a detective finally came to take statements from the family. He asked the same questions the first officer had asked. He took more notes. He said he would look into it. Louise felt a flicker of hope. Surely now, with a detective involved, things would move forward. Surely someone would find her daughters. But the detective's investigation was cursory at best. There were no searches organized. No bloodhounds brought in to follow scents. No canvassing of the neighborhood to interview potential witnesses. The case was already being classified in whispered conversations as a runaway situation. 2 teenage girls from a poor black family in Augusta, Georgia? They'd probably just run off. They'd turn up eventually. This assumption ignored everything about Danette and Jeanette. They were good students at Lucy Laney High School. They didn't get into trouble. They didn't have boyfriends they might have run away with. They were homebodies who spent their time with family, who worried about mundane things like bus fare and homework. The idea that they would abandon their mother, their siblings, their entire lives on a whim was absurd. But it was easier to believe than the alternative, that something sinister had happened on a Sunday afternoon in broad daylight. The first week passed. Then the second. The family's flyers faded in the sun and rain. People stopped calling with tips. Not that there had been many to begin with. The local news ran a single story about the missing twins and then moved on. There were other stories, other tragedies, other crimes. The Milbrook twins became a footnote. Louise couldn't move on. She called the sheriff's office every few days, asking for updates. There were never any. She contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who created posters of the girls. She reached out to television shows, to journalists, to anyone who might amplify her daughter's story. She wrote letters to John Walsh, to Oprah Winfrey, to any media personality she could think of. Most never responded. Behind closed doors, details about the day of the disappearance began to shift and blur. Some accounts suggested the girls had been seen near their father's house on 3rd Street. John Milbrook, the twins' biological father, had not been part of their lives in any meaningful way. He and Louise had divorced when the girls were 2 years old. He'd been abusive, and Louise had left to protect her children. Now, whispers suggested that maybe John knew something. Maybe the girls had gone to see him. Maybe he'd been involved. But these were just whispers, rumors, threads that went nowhere. John Millbrook wasn't cooperating with investigators. Not that they seemed particularly interested in pushing him. The case was already cold, freezing over like a pond in winter. In those crucial first 48 hours, when the twins' trail should have been pursued with urgency and intensity, almost nothing had been done. The delay in taking the initial report, the errors in the paperwork, the lack of immediate search efforts, the assumption that the girls were runaways. Each failure compounded the next, creating a cascade of missed opportunities. Experts in missing persons cases will tell you that the first 24 to 48 hours are critical. During this window, witnesses remember faces and license plates. Security camera footage hasn't been overwritten. Physical evidence hasn't been contaminated by weather or foot traffic. If a victim has been taken against their will, there's still a chance they're being held nearby, still a chance of rescue. For Danette and Jeanette Millbrook, those critical hours were squandered. While Louise waited the mandatory 24 hours to even file a report, while the paperwork was being filled out incorrectly, while days passed before a detective bothered to interview the family, the trail went cold. Whatever had happened at or near the Pump and Shop gas station that Sunday afternoon became harder and harder to reconstruct. Months turned into a year. April 2nd, 1991, marked the twins' 16th birthday. They weren't there to celebrate. Shanta watched her mother cry that day, watched her light candles on a cake no one would eat. The apartment felt haunted by the absence of laughter, by the silence where Danette's voice should have been, by the empty space where Jeanette used to sit. And then came the devastating news. On April 8th, 1991, just over a year after the twins vanished, a detective came to the house. Louise's heart raced. Had they found her daughters? Were they alive? The detective's face was grim. He told the family that the case was being closed. The twins, he explained, were now 17 years old. Under Georgia law, they could no longer be forced to return home even if they were found. Since they were classified as runaways, there was no reason to continue the investigation. Louise felt the world tilt beneath her. Her daughters weren't runaways. They hadn't left voluntarily. Something had happened to them. But the detective was unmoved. The case was closed. The file would be archived. There was nothing more to be done. But there was another, even more confusing development. When Louise contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to update them, she was told something shocking. According to their records, the twins had been found. A detective had called to inform them that Danette and Jeanette were no longer missing, that the case had been resolved. But this made no sense. The girls hadn't been found. They were still missing. Who had called NCMEC? Why had someone told them the twins were no longer missing? The contradictions piled up. The case was closed because the girls were runaways who could no longer be forced home. But also, according to NCMEC, the girls had been found. Except they hadn't been found. They were still missing. The explanations made no sense, and no one at the sheriff's office seemed interested in clarifying the confusion. The first 48 hours had been critical. The investigation that should have followed was essential. Both had been bungled beyond repair. And now, officially, the search for Danette and Jeanette Millbrook was over before it had truly begun. The years that followed were a nightmare of dead ends and false hope. Louise Sturgis refused to accept that her daughters were simply gone, that they had vanished without a trace. She continued to call the sheriff's office, continued to ask questions, continued to push for answers. Most of the time, she was brushed off. The case was closed. There was nothing to investigate. Move on. But Louise couldn't move on. How could she? Her daughters' beds sat empty. Their clothes hung untouched in the closet. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone was marked by their absence. Shanta, the younger sister, grew up in the shadow of the disappearance. She watched her mother grieve, watched her hope and despair in equal measure. She promised herself that one day, she would find out what happened to Danette and Jeanette. As the 1990s war on Augusta, Georgia, was plagued by a series of violent crimes against young black women. It wasn't just the Millbrook twins. Other girls and women went missing. Some were found dead. The crimes bore similar hallmarks. Victims taken from areas near Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, near the same neighborhoods the twins had walked through. Bodies were discovered in wooded areas in neighboring Aiken County, South Carolina. One name began to surface in connection with these crimes: Joseph Patrick Washington. Washington lived on Hale Street in Augusta and worked at the Mary Brickyard. He was a stocky man, only 5 feet 4 inches tall, but powerfully built. In 1993, 3 years after the twins disappeared, Washington was arrested in connection with a series of violent sexual assaults and attempted murders. His method of operation was terrifying in its consistency. He would approach young black women. His preferred victims were teenagers and women in their 20s with short hair. He'd pull up in a vehicle, brandish a gun, and order them inside. If they refused, he'd threaten to kill them on the spot. Once he had them in his vehicle, he would drive them to a secondary location, often the brickyard where he worked, and sexually assault them. After the assaults, he would shoot his victims in the stomach and leave them for dead. Mills crumpled, his vision exploding into white stars, then darkness, then swimming, nauseous consciousness. Blood, warm and sticky, began matting his gray hair, running down his collar in dark rivulets. Through the haze of pain and shock, Mills felt rough hands hauling him upright, shoving him back toward the controls. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, a percussion of agony that made his vision swim. "Drive," a voice commanded, half a mile up the track, to the bridge. Mills's hands trembled on the controls, slick with his own blood. The train lurched forward, carrying its cargo of money and unsuspecting postal workers toward Bedtime Bridge, where 15 masked men waited in the darkness like a pack of wolves. The entire sequence, from the first glimpse of the amber signal to the violent assault, had taken less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes that would change British criminal history forever. 5 minutes that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. At Bedtime Bridge, the scene that unfolded was orchestrated chaos. The gang had detached the first 2 carriages, the engine and the high-value package coach, from the rest of the train. While Mills slumped in the cab, fighting to stay conscious, gang members in boiler suits and army uniforms formed a human chain. They worked with the efficiency of a military operation, passing 120 mailbags filled with currency from the train to waiting Land Rovers below. The bags were heavy, each one stuffed with £1 and £5 notes, both the older white notes and the newer, smaller blue ones. Inside the HVP coach, 5 postal workers had been sorting mail when the attack began. The first sign of trouble was the sound of breaking glass, a window completely smashed inward. Then a man with a heavy metal crowbar climbed through, followed by others pouring through the corridor door. "It's a raid!" one officer shouted. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The attackers, brandishing iron bars and kashes, forced the workers to the far end of the van. "Stay down. Don't move. Don't look up." The commands were barked with military precision. One robber stood guard while others hurled bag after bag of high-value packets through the shattered windows to accomplices below. The robbery itself took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to steal £2,595,997 and 10 shillings. 20 minutes to execute what had taken months to plan. When the last bag was loaded, the gang shoved Mills and Whitby, both injured, both traumatized, into the HVP coach with the postal workers. "Stay here for 30 minutes, one of the robbers ordered. "Don't move. Don't try to contact anyone. 30 minutes. That single command would prove to be the robbers' first mistake, a crucial clue that would set the entire investigation in motion. The convoy of vehicles disappeared into the darkness, heading north on farm tracks and back roads. In the train, 7 men sat in stunned silence, listening to their own ragged breathing, to Mills's labored gasps as blood continued to seep from his head wound. They counted the seconds, the minutes, weighing their duty against the threat of violence. At 3:45 a.m., just 15 minutes after the gang's departure, 2 of the postal officers couldn't wait any longer. They left the coach and ran, stumbling in the darkness, their hearts hammering, until they reached the nearest farm. The elderly couple who answered their frantic pounding stared in confusion at the bloodied, shaking men on their doorstep. "The train's been robbed." One of them managed to gasp out, "Call the police. Please, call the police now." It was 4:15 a.m. when the call reached the Buckinghamshire Constabulary. The dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency as the details came through. Mail train attacked, driver assaulted, millions stolen. Detective Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell, head of the Buckinghamshire Crime Investigation Department, was roused from sleep by a telephone call that would consume the next months of his life. Futrell arrived at the scene as dawn began to paint the sky in shades of gray and pink. The sight that greeted him would remain burned in his memory forever. The train sat like a wounded animal on the tracks, its windows shattered, mailbags strewn across the railway embankment. Jack Mills, sitting in an ambulance wrapped in a blanket, looked 20 years older than he had 6 hours earlier. Blood had dried in his hair, on his collar, down the front of his uniform. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette, and Futrell could see the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had glimpsed something primal and violent. The crime scene stretched along the track, marked by the detritus of the robbery. Broken glass, scattered mail, the leather gloves still stuffed over the green signal light, the batteries that powered the false red signal. Futrell walked the site slowly, methodically, his practiced eye cataloging every detail. But even as the sun rose higher, illuminating the full scope of the scene, one thing became painfully clear. The robbers had left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints on the signal equipment. No footprints in the gravel. They'd worn army boots that left generic treads. No discarded clothing. No cigarette butts. No careless mistakes. These weren't opportunistic thieves or amateur criminals. This was a professional operation, planned with military precision and executed with ruthless efficiency. But they had made one critical error: the 30-minute warning. Futrell stood at the trackside, his mind racing through the implications. Why 30 minutes? The answer was obvious. Because the gang needed 30 minutes to reach their hideout, which meant that hideout was within a 30-minute drive of Berdago Bridge. By 8 a.m., just 5 hours after the robbery, Futrell had assembled a task force and issued his first orders. They would search every farm, every outbuilding, every possible hideout within a 30-mile radius of the crime scene. He had no way of knowing that his decision to search outward from the scene, rather than inward from a perimeter, would later be his greatest regret. But in those first crucial hours, with the clock ticking and the trail growing colder by the minute, it seemed the logical approach. The race was on, and in those first 5 hours, the criminals still had the upper hand. By mid-morning on August 8th, news of the robbery had spread like wildfire through the British media. Reporters descended on the quiet Buckinghamshire countryside, their cameras and notebooks transforming Sears Crossing into a circus of speculation and sensation. The Evening Standard's afternoon edition screamed the headline, "Biggest ever mail robbery." Photographs of the crime scene dominated front pages across the nation. The public was transfixed, horrified, and, perhaps most dangerously for the investigation, fascinated. Detective Chief Superintendent Futrell stood at the command post that had been hastily established near the railway bridge, watching the media frenzy with a mixture of frustration and grim determination. Every hour that passed without a break in the case felt like a personal failure. His officers were working around the clock, conducting interviews, checking and rechecking the crime scene, following up on the flood of tips that had begun pouring in from across the country. But the clock was ticking, and Futrell knew it. The first 48 hours of any major investigation were critical, the period when memories were freshest, when evidence was most likely to be found, when the criminals might still be close enough to catch. Every minute that slipped away was a minute the gang could use to cover their tracks, to disperse, to disappear into the underworld that had spawned them. Jack Mills had been taken to hospital, where doctors stitched the gash in his scalp and treated him for severe concussion. But even in his traumatized state, Mills insisted on giving a statement. Futrell sat by his bedside, notebook in hand, listening as the veteran driver described the attack in halting, pain-filled words. "There were so many of them," Mills whispered, his voice raw. "They came from everywhere. I tried to fight, but..." His hand moved unconsciously to the bandage on his head. I never saw who hit me, never saw his face. Just the bar coming down, and then nothing. David Whitby's account corroborated Mills's story, adding details about the cut telephone wires, the sudden ambush at the trackside. The 5 postal workers from the HVP coach provided descriptions of the attackers. 15 men, maybe more, all wearing balaclavas and boiler suits, all moving with practiced efficiency. But none of them could provide any identifying details. No faces. No distinctive voices. No mistakes that might lead to an arrest. By lunchtime on August 8th, it had become clear to Futrell that this case was beyond the resources of the Buckinghamshire Constabulary. He made the call to Scotland Yard, requesting assistance from the Metropolitan Police's Flying Squad, an elite unit known for tackling major organized crime. Within hours, Detective Chief Superintendent Ernest Millen, head of the Flying Squad, arrived on the scene with his team. The investigation now expanded dramatically. Over 70 dedicated officers were assigned to the case, working in shifts around the clock. They began the painstaking process of interviewing the 72 postal workers who had been on the train, checking the backgrounds of railway employees, reviewing staff lists for any suspicious patterns or connections to known criminals. The Post Office Investigation Branch launched its own parallel inquiry, focused initially on determining the exact amount stolen and investigating the possibility of an inside job. The fact that all 3 of the newly secured HVP carriages, fitted with alarms, barred windows, and reinforced doors, were out of service on the night of the robbery raised troubling questions. Had someone ensured that the train would be carrying the less secure reserve carriage? Had information about the bank holiday weekend's unusually large cash shipment been leaked? Meanwhile, teams of uniformed officers began the methodical search of the countryside surrounding the crime scene. They fanned out across Buckinghamshire, knocking on doors, checking barns and outbuildings, interviewing farmers and villagers. Did you see anything unusual? Strange vehicles? Unfamiliar faces? Anything at all out of the ordinary? The answers were uniformly disappointing. Nothing. No one had seen anything. It was as if the gang had vanished into thin air. But on the morning of August 9th, 26 hours after the robbery, the first real lead emerged. A shopkeeper in the nearby village of Oakley reported that several weeks earlier, she had served a group of men who seemed out of place. City types, she called them, not locals. They had bought large quantities of food, tinned goods, bread, eggs, more than any normal family would need. She remembered because one of them had paid with a crisp new 10-pound note, unusual in a village where most transactions were conducted in coins and worn bills. Futrell's pulse quickened as he listened to the report. Large food purchases, city men, just weeks before the robbery. He dispatched a team to Oakley immediately, instructing them to canvass the area thoroughly to find out if anyone else had seen these mysterious strangers. As Friday, August 9th wore on, the investigation generated a mountain of paperwork, witness statements, forensic reports, background checks. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, and Futrell worried that critical clues might be lost in the avalanche of data. He organized his officers into specialized teams. One focused on the crime scene evidence, another on interviewing witnesses, a third on following up tips from the public, and a fourth on tracking down known criminals with the skills and connections to pull off such a sophisticated heist. The Postmaster General, Reginald Bevins, returned early from his holiday in Spain to face a barrage of questions from the press and Parliament. The robbery had become a national scandal, a humiliating demonstration of Britain's vulnerability to organized crime. Bevins announced a £10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the robbers, a sum that would eventually grow to £260,000 as banks and insurance companies added their own contributions. The massive reward had an immediate effect. The phone lines at police headquarters were flooded with tips, most of them useless, some of them deliberately misleading, but a few, Futrell hoped, potentially valuable. Every call had to be logged, every lead followed up, every scrap of information evaluated and cross-referenced. Saturday, August 10th dawned with no major breakthrough. Futrell stood in the incident room, surrounded by maps and photographs, feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. Somewhere out there, probably within a 30-mile radius of where he stood, 15 criminals were sitting on a fortune in stolen money. They were counting it, dividing it, celebrating their success. And with every hour that passed, they were getting farther away, covering their tracks more thoroughly, disappearing into the criminal underworld that had birthed and sheltered them. The press had begun to romanticize the robbery, drawing comparisons to Jesse James and the Wild West, portraying the gang as daring outlaws who had outsmarted the authorities. Futrell found this lionization offensive and dangerous. These weren't folk heroes. They were violent criminals who had brutally assaulted a 58-year-old train driver and traumatized 7 innocent workers. But he also understood the public's fascination. The scale of the theft was unprecedented. The planning and execution demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication rarely seen in Britain. And the fact that the gang had escaped without firing a single shot, despite the violence of the assault on Mills, added an element of restraint that some interpreted as a twisted form of honor among thieves. Futrell knew better. He had seen Jack Mills in the hospital, had watched the veteran driver struggle to form coherent sentences, had noted the tremor in his hands that suggested lasting neurological damage. There was nothing honorable about this crime, nothing romantic about the trauma inflicted on innocent working men. Late on Saturday evening, as the 48-hour mark approached with no major breaks in the case, Futrell made a decision that would prove critical. He ordered his officers to expand their search radius slightly, but to focus more intensely on farmhouses and isolated properties. Places where a large group of men could gather without attracting immediate attention. Places with outbuildings where vehicles could be hidden. Places with enough privacy to sort and divide millions of pounds in stolen currency. It was a refinement of the search strategy, not a radical change. But it would make all the difference. Because 25 miles from Berdego Bridge, at an isolated farmhouse called Leatherslade, 15 criminals were making mistakes. They were leaving fingerprints on ketchup bottles and Monopoly boards. They were arguing about money and blame. And they were beginning to panic because the accomplice they had hired to burn down the farm after they left, the man whose job was to destroy all evidence of their presence, had lost his nerve and disappeared. The police didn't know it yet, but the window of opportunity was closing fast. In less than 3 days, that farmhouse would be discovered. And when it was, the careful planning that had made the robbery possible would unravel with stunning speed. The first 48 hours were slipping away, and the gang's perfect crime was about to become Britain's most famous criminal disaster. On Sunday, August 11th, a herdsman named John Maris stood in a field adjacent to Leatherslade Farm, watching a lorry pull into the property's yard. Over the past few days, Maris had noticed unusual activity at the farm. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, windows that had been blacked out with newspaper or cloth, and the strangest detail of all, the new tenants had allegedly paid £100 over the asking price for the property. In rural Buckinghamshire in 1963, such behavior was more than unusual. It was suspicious. Maris knew about the train robbery, of course. Everyone in Britain knew about it. The newspapers had been full of nothing else for 3 days, and the police had been asking questions throughout the area, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The herdsman made a decision that would crack the case wide open. He walked to the nearest telephone box and called the police. "There's something not right at Leatherslade Farm," he told the officer who answered. "Strange goings-on. Vehicles I haven't seen before. I think you should take a look." The initial response was frustratingly slow. A single patrol car was dispatched to check out the tip, and the officers who arrived found the farm apparently deserted. They noted it in their report and moved on. But Maris wasn't satisfied. He called again the next day, insisting that the police conduct a more thorough investigation. This time, his persistence paid off. On Tuesday, August 13th, 5 days after the robbery, a police sergeant and constable arrived at Leatherslade Farm with instructions to conduct a comprehensive search. What they found inside stunned them into momentary silence. The farmhouse was a treasure trove of evidence. In the kitchen, they discovered large quantities of food, enough to feed 15 men for several days. Sleeping bags were scattered throughout the bedrooms. Empty beer bottles littered the floors. In the yard, they found Land Rovers and a lorry that had been hastily painted yellow in a clumsy attempt at disguise. But most damning of all were the mailbags, 120 of them, still bearing the stamps and labels of the Royal Mail's high-value package service. The sergeant immediately radioed for backup. Within hours, Leatherslade Farm had been transformed into the focal point of Britain's largest criminal investigation. Detective Chief Superintendent Futrell arrived with a team of forensic specialists, photographers, and fingerprint experts. They cordoned off the entire property and began the meticulous process of documenting and collecting evidence. What they found was almost too good to be true. Despite the gang's careful planning, despite their use of gloves and balaclavas during the robbery itself, they had made careless mistakes at the farm. Fingerprints were everywhere, on door handles, on beer bottles, on food containers. Most incredibly, they found clear prints on a Monopoly game board and a ketchup bottle that had been left on the kitchen table. The Monopoly set told its own story. The gang had played the board game using real money from the robbery. Stacks of £1 and £5 notes serving as game currency while they celebrated their success and waited to divide the spoils. It was a moment of hubris that would prove their undoing. Detective Superintendent Ray from the Metropolitan Police led the forensic team through every room, every outbuilding, every vehicle. They collected dozens of fingerprints, photographed banknote wrappers bearing bank stamps from across Scotland and northern England, gathered post office sacks and registered mail packages that the gang had been too careless or too confident to destroy. In all, they filled evidence bag after evidence bag with material that would eventually help secure convictions. But even this breakthrough came with frustration. The farm was empty. The gang had fled, likely spooked by media reports about the police search radius. Ironically, those reports had been inaccurate. Newspapers had mistakenly reported that police were searching within a 30-mile radius, rather than the intended 30-minute driving time. The error had actually worked in the gang's favor, causing them to abandon the farm earlier than planned, but also allowing them to escape before the police arrived. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler arrived at Leatherslade Farm on the afternoon of August 13th. Butler, who had just been appointed to head a specialized 6-man train robbery squad, was known throughout Scotland Yard as One-Day Tommy for his legendary ability to solve cases with almost supernatural speed. But even Butler, staring at the evidence-rich scene before him, knew this case wouldn't be wrapped up in a day. The discovery of the farm marked a critical turning point in the investigation. For the first time since the robbery, the police had solid physical evidence linking specific individuals to the crime. The fingerprints would need to be matched against criminal records, but Butler's experienced. I told him these weren't the prints of amateur thieves. These belonged to professional criminals, men with records, men who were already in the system. Over the next week, the forensic team worked around the clock processing the evidence from Leatherslade Farm. They lifted palm prints, fingerprints, and even partial prints from dozens of surfaces. Each print was photographed, catalogued, and sent to Scotland Yard's Fingerprint Bureau for comparison against the millions of records on file. It was painstaking work, requiring endless patience and meticulous attention to detail, but it was work that would bear fruit. By August 20th, the first matches began to come through. A fingerprint on the ketchup bottle belonged to a known criminal named Gordon Goody, a man with a history of violent robberies. Another print matched Bruce Reynolds, a sophisticated burglar and armed robber who had been on police radar for years. More names followed: Ronnie Biggs, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, all career criminals with the skills and connections to pull off a major heist. For Detective Chief Superintendent Butler, these identifications were both vindication and frustration. Now he knew who he was looking for, but finding them would be another matter entirely. The criminal underworld was vast and impenetrable, a parallel society with its own codes and rules. These men would have gone to ground, hiding with friends, family, or criminal associates who knew better than to cooperate with the police. Butler assembled his team and began planning the arrests. They would need to move quickly, before the gang members learned that the police had identified them and fled the country. But they also needed to be thorough, gathering enough evidence to ensure convictions. A single mistake could result in acquittals, and Butler was determined that these men would face justice. The investigation now entered a new phase, one of surveillance, informants, and calculated raids. Butler's flying squad had contacts throughout the London criminal underworld, and they began quietly putting out feelers, looking for anyone who might know where the gang members had gone to ground. They offered deals, immunity, reduced sentences, anything to encourage cooperation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A lawyer approached Detective Chief Superintendent Millen in the smoking room of an exclusive West End club, mentioning that he might know someone willing to provide information about the train robbers. The source, when eventually contacted, provided 18 names, a comprehensive list that confirmed and expanded upon the identifications already made through fingerprints. With this intelligence, Butler began planning simultaneous raids. The arrests would need to be coordinated carefully, conducted at the same time to prevent gang members from warning each other. It was a complex operation, requiring dozens of officers and precise timing. But even as the net tightened around the gang, time was working against the police. Some of the robbers, sensing the danger, were already making plans to flee the country. Money was being moved, false identities arranged, escape routes planned. The criminals who had executed one of the most sophisticated robberies in British history were proving equally sophisticated in their attempts to evade capture. The race between investigation and escape had entered its final, most critical phase, and the outcome was far from certain. The first arrest came at dawn on August 22nd. Roger Corddry, the signal specialist who had rigged the false lights at Sears Crossing, was taken into custody at a boarding house in Bournemouth. Police found £141,000 in cash hidden in his room, money still wrapped in the distinctive paper bands used by the banks that had shipped it to London on that fateful August night. Corddry maintained his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. Over the following weeks, Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler's team executed a series of carefully coordinated raids across London and southern England. Each arrest followed the same pattern. Early morning, overwhelming force, no chance for the suspects to destroy evidence or warn their accomplices. Bob Welch was arrested on August 23rd. Charlie Wilson was picked up at his home in Clapham on August 22nd, still spending money from the robbery with reckless abandon. Brian Field, a solicitor's clerk suspected of providing inside information, was arrested along with his boss, who was later released without charge. By early September, 12 men were in custody. Each arrest brought new evidence, new connections, new pieces of the puzzle that Butler's team was meticulously assembling. The police recovered more cash, pound 47, 245 from one suspect, smaller amounts from others, but the bulk of the £2.6 million remained missing, presumably hidden or already moved abroad. The accused were held at Aylesbury Prison as the investigation continued and the prosecution built its case. The sheer scale of the evidence was staggering. Over 2,500 witness statements had been taken, requiring the testimony of more than 250 witnesses in court. The forensic evidence from Leatherslade Farm alone filled dozens of exhibits. The legal proceedings would become one of the most complex and high-profile trials in British criminal history. Because the case was so large and the number of defendants so great, a temporary courtroom had to be constructed within the Aylesbury Rural District Council chambers. The local magistrate's court was simply too small to accommodate the proceedings. The trial, when it finally began in January 1964, became a media sensation. Reporters from across Britain and around the world descended on the quiet market town, transforming the courthouse into a circus of photographers, journalists, and curious onlookers. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the fingerprint evidence from Leatherslade Farm, demonstrating beyond doubt that the defendants had been present at the gang's hideout. They called postal workers who identified items of clothing and equipment used in the robbery. They brought forward Jack Mills, still recovering from his injuries, who testified about the brutal assault that had left him unable to return to work. Mills's testimony was particularly powerful. He described the attack with quiet dignity, never seeking sympathy but making it clear that the robbery had fundamentally altered his life. The defense attorneys tried to suggest that his injuries were not as severe as claimed, but medical experts testified about the lasting neurological damage he had suffered. Mills would never drive a train again. The career that had defined his adult life was over, ended by 15 masked men who valued money over human dignity. The defense tried various strategies. Some defendants claimed they had been at Leatherslade Farm, but only as innocent visitors, unaware of the robbery planning. Others insisted the fingerprint evidence was contaminated or fabricated. A few maintained complete silence, refusing to testify or even acknowledge the proceedings. But the weight of evidence was crushing, and the jury saw through the transparent lies and evasions. The verdicts came down in April 1964. 12 men were found guilty of conspiracy to rob and armed robbery. The judge, Mr. Justice Edmund Davies, delivered sentences that shocked even hardened observers of the British legal system. 7 of the ringleaders received 30 years in prison, unprecedented terms for a non-violent robbery, or so it had been characterized, despite the assault on Mills. The judge made clear that he viewed the crime as a direct assault on the security and stability of British society. "Let us clear out of the way any romantic notions of daredevilry," Justice Davies said in his sentencing remarks. "This is nothing less than a sordid crime of violence inspired by vast greed." But even as the convicted men were led away to begin their sentences, the story of the great train robbery was far from over. 3 men had never been caught. Bruce Reynolds, the alleged mastermind, had disappeared into the criminal underground. 2 others, known only as numbers to the rest of the gang, remained unidentified. And approximately £2 million of the stolen money was still missing, presumably hidden in safe deposit boxes, foreign bank accounts, or buried in locations known only to the robbers. More dramatically, some of the convicted men had no intention of serving their full sentences. Charlie Wilson escaped from Winson Green Prison in August 1964, just 1 year after the robbery, in a daring breakout that involved a 3-man team and took less than 3 minutes to execute. He fled to Canada, where he lived under an assumed identity until his recapture in 1968. Ronnie Biggs's escape was even more spectacular. In July 1965, he scaled the walls of Wandsworth Prison using a rope ladder fashioned from furniture stuffing and hid in an outgoing furniture van. With help from the criminal underworld, he underwent plastic surgery in Paris, then fled to Australia. When police closed in there, he moved to Brazil, where he would remain a fugitive for 36 years, becoming a celebrity of sorts and taunting British authorities with his freedom. Bruce Reynolds, the alleged mastermind, remained at large until 1968, when he was finally arrested in Torquay. The dramatic dawn raid that netted Reynolds made front-page news across Britain. He received a 10-year sentence, far less than the original gang members but still substantial. The human cost of the robbery extended far beyond the courtroom. Jack Mills died in 1970, just 7 years after the attack, of leukemia. His family has always maintained that the assault contributed to his early death, that the trauma and head injury accelerated his decline. Whether or not this is medically provable, the emotional truth is undeniable. Jack Mills was never the same man after August 8, 1963. David Whitby, the young second man who was thrown down the embankment, struggled with the psychological trauma of the attack. He died of a heart attack in 1972, at just 34 years old. The robbery had claimed 2 more victims, though their names are rarely mentioned in accounts that focus on the criminals' daring and subsequent adventures. The legacy of the Great Train Robbery is complex and troubling. On one hand, it remains a masterpiece of criminal planning and execution, a case study in how insider information, careful preparation, and ruthless efficiency can overcome seemingly insurmountable security measures. On the other hand, it represents a watershed moment in British criminal history, marking the emergence of organized crime as a serious threat to public safety and economic security. The robbery led to comprehensive reforms in how Britain transported valuable cargo. The old traveling post office trains, with their minimal security and reliance on obscurity for protection, were phased out. New procedures were implemented for handling high-value packages. Security measures that had been recommended but not implemented were finally put in place, albeit too late for the £2.6 million that had already been stolen. Detective Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell retired at the mandatory age of 55 on the last day of the trial, having seen the investigation through to its conclusion. He would later write a book about the case, and he continued to express disgust at any media that romanticized the robbers. He also admitted his one regret: conducting the initial search radiating outward from the crime scene rather than inward from a 30-mile perimeter. If he had ordered the latter strategy, Leatherslade Farm might have been discovered within 24 hours, and more of the gang might have been caught with the money still in their possession. Tommy Butler, true to his reputation, never gave up hunting the escaped robbers. He continued pursuing leads long after his official retirement, driven by a personal sense of justice and perhaps by the knowledge that the case had become his defining professional achievement. He died in 1980, having seen most, but not all, of the train robbers brought to justice. As for the money, the final accounting was sobering. Of the £2,595,997 stolen, only about £400,000 was ever recovered. The rest disappeared into the criminal economy, laundered through complex transactions, converted to property and assets, or simply spent on the high life that so many of the robbers briefly enjoyed before their arrests. Some of it is probably still buried somewhere in the British countryside, waiting to be discovered by a lucky metal detectorist or construction crew. The Great Train Robbery entered British folklore, inspiring films, television series, books, and endless speculation. Some of the robbers became celebrities after their release from prison, trading on their notoriety for money and fame. Ronnie Biggs, in particular, became something of a cult figure during his years in Brazil, selling t-shirts and giving interviews. His story transformed from serious crime into entertainment. But for those who were there, for the postal workers who were terrorized, for the families of Jack Mills and David Whitby, for the police officers who spent months hunting the gang, the crime was anything but entertainment. It was a brutal assault, a violation of trust, and a demonstration that even the most careful planning and security measures can be overcome by determined criminals willing to use violence. The leather glove that covered the green signal light at Sears Crossing is preserved in the Thames Valley Police Museum, along with other artifacts from the investigation. It serves as a tangible reminder of the night when 15 men brought a train to a halt and changed British criminal history forever. And it reminds us that in any crime, there are always victims, not just institutions and insurance companies, but real people whose lives are forever altered by violence and greed. The Great Train Robbery remains Britain's most famous heist, a crime that captured the public imagination and demonstrated both the vulnerabilities of modern society and the inevitable consequences of choosing a criminal path. For all the planning, all the intelligence, all the careful execution, the gang's perfect crime unraveled in the end. The first 48 hours may have seemed to belong to the criminals, but time and justice belonged to the investigators who refused to give up. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3: The Billionaire Who Vanished. The Teddy Wong Mystery. The Mercedes-Benz slowed as it climbed Magazine Gap Road, and in that single heartbeat of deceleration, a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars ceased to exist. The humid Hong Kong evening wrapped around Teddy Wong like a silk shroud as he left the Royal Hong Kong Jockey Club Gymnasium at 8:15 p.m. At 56 years old, the founder of the Chinacham Group maintained his strict routine with the precision of a Swiss watch, a habit that would prove fatal. His workout had ended exactly on schedule. His silver Mercedes awaited him in the parking lot, gleaming under the amber streetlights. Wong slid behind the wheel, his muscles still warm from exercise, and began the familiar drive toward his mansion on the Peak, Hong Kong's most exclusive neighborhood. Magazine Gap Road twisted upward through the humid darkness, flanked by dense vegetation that seemed to press closer as night deepened. The road was quiet at this hour, carrying only occasional traffic between the wealthy districts below and the palatial homes above. As his vehicle climbed the serpentine road, Wang's mind likely wandered to business matters, the pharmaceutical empire he'd built from his father's modest paint company, the hundreds of buildings bearing the Chinachim name across Hong Kong's skyline, the complex negotiations that consumed his days. He was a man known for his frugality despite his vast wealth, famous for his predictable habits and his refusal to indulge in the ostentatious displays favored by many of his billionaire peers. The attack came with surgical precision at approximately 8:30 p.m. Multiple vehicles surrounded his Mercedes, forcing it to slow. Before Wang could react, his door was wrenched open. Gloved hands seized him. The kidnapping was executed with the efficiency of a military operation. No wasted movements, no hesitation, no witnesses. Within seconds, Teddy Wang was pulled from his vehicle and thrust into another car. The entire abduction took less than 2 minutes. His Mercedes was left idling on the roadside, driver's door hanging open, engines still running. Inside, his gym bag sat on the passenger seat. His keys dangled from the ignition. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the tropical night air. By 9 p.m., when Wang failed to arrive home, his wife Nina, known throughout Hong Kong by her nickname Little Sweetie, felt the first tremors of panic. Teddy was never late. His punctuality was legendary, almost pathological. He followed the same routes, kept the same schedules, lived by the same routines day after day. A 30-minute delay was unthinkable. Nina paced through their peak mansion, her trademark pigtails swinging with each anxious turn. The house, despite its size, felt suddenly oppressive. She tried his mobile phone repeatedly. No answer. She called the jockey club. Yes, he had left as scheduled. She called his office. No one had heard from him. By 9:30 p.m., Nina contacted the Royal Hong Kong Police. The officer who took her call listened with growing concern. Teddy Wang was no ordinary citizen. He was one of Hong Kong's wealthiest men, and more significantly, he had survived a previous kidnapping in 1983, an ordeal that had ended only after Nina paid a ransom of $33 million and Teddy was released after 8 days chained to a bed. The police knew what Nina knew. This wasn't a traffic accident or a spontaneous detour. Teddy Wang had been taken. The first patrol car reached the abandoned Mercedes by 10 p.m. Officers found the scene eerily pristine. No blood, no signs of struggle. The vehicle's interior was undisturbed except for the missing driver. Forensics teams were dispatched immediately, their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the roadside vegetation as they searched for clues in the darkness. Steve Vickers, chief of the Royal Hong Kong Police Criminal Intelligence Bureau, received the notification at 10:30 p.m. He knew Teddy Wang personally from the 1983 kidnapping. As he sped toward police headquarters, Vickers felt a sinking dread. The 1983 case had ended well because the kidnappers had been professionals who wanted money, not blood. But this second abduction, coming 7 years later, felt different. Wang had ignored all security recommendations after his first kidnapping. He'd refused bodyguards, dismissed armored vehicles, continued his predictable routines. He was an easy target, Vickers would later reflect, and he knew it. By 11 p.m., a command center had been established. Detectives began reconstructing Wang's final known movements. The Jockey Club's security footage showed him leaving alone, declining offers from staff to escort him to his car. Witnesses on Magazine Gap Road were being located and interviewed. One motorist remembered seeing a Mercedes pulled over with its lights on, but had thought nothing of it at the time. The critical first hours of any kidnapping investigation are a race against time. Statistics show that if a kidnapped victim isn't recovered within 48 hours, the chances of a positive outcome plummet. Every minute that passed moved Teddy Wang further from salvation. Nina Wang sat in the police station's interview room as midnight approached, answering questions in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. The detectives could see she was barely holding herself together. Her hands trembled as she provided details about their daily routines, their business affairs, anyone who might hold a grudge. She mentioned the 1983 kidnapping. She spoke of death threats they'd received over the years, disgruntled contractors, business rivals, people who believed Wang had cheated them. The list of potential suspects was staggeringly long. As the clock struck midnight on April 10, 1990, Teddy Wong had been missing for 3.5 hours. His kidnappers had vanished into a city of 6 million people like ghosts. The phone at the Wong mansion remained silent. No ransom demand had been made. The waiting had begun. Dawn broke over Hong Kong on April 11th with the city's characteristic haze, the sun struggling through layers of humidity and pollution. In the police command center, officers who had worked through the night looked haggard, sustained by coffee and cigarettes and the desperate hope that they could bring Teddy Wong home alive. Still, the phone hadn't rung. Steve Vickers had dealt with 27 previous kidnapping cases in Hong Kong. He understood the psychology of abduction, the deadly dance between law enforcement and criminals. Professional kidnappers typically made contact within 12 hours. They wanted to set terms, establish communication, begin negotiations. Amateur kidnappers, driven by impulse and panic, were far more dangerous. They killed out of fear. By 8 a.m., 12 hours into the abduction, the silence was deafening. Nina Wong hadn't slept. She sat in her mansion, surrounded by police officers and phone-trapping equipment, staring at the telephone as if she could will it to ring. Her personal assistant brought her tea that went cold, untouched. Outside, the morning rush hour flowed past her gates, the city continuing its relentless rhythm while her world had stopped. The media had gotten wind of the story. By mid-morning, reporters camped outside the Wong mansion and the police headquarters. Teddy Wong's disappearance was front-page news. Hong Kong, still reeling from the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre and anxious about the looming 1997 handover to China, was reminded that its veneer of safety could crack at any moment. Forensic analysis of the Mercedes yielded frustratingly little. The kidnappers had been meticulous. No fingerprints save Wong's own. No foreign DNA. The tire tracks on the roadside were too degraded to provide useful impressions. It was as if professionals had orchestrated every detail. At noon, 15 hours into the case, investigators made their first breakthrough. A security guard at a nearby residential complex remembered seeing 3 vehicles moving in formation up Magazine Gap Road around 8:30 p.m. the previous evening. The convoy had struck him as unusual, almost military in its coordination. He provided descriptions: a black sedan, a white van, possibly a motorcycle as a spotter. The vehicles were generic, common throughout Hong Kong. Without license plate numbers, the lead offered direction but not destination. Vickers assembled his team at 2:00 p.m. for a strategic briefing. On a whiteboard, they'd mapped out potential scenarios. Scenario 1, professional kidnapping by organized crime, likely triad connected. Motivation, ransom, probability, 75%. Scenario 2, business dispute turned violent. Motivation, revenge or elimination of competition. Probability, 20%. Scenario 3, political abduction related to mainland Chinese interests. Motivation, unknown. Probability, 5%. We have to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, Vickers told his team. In the 1983 case, Nina paid the ransom immediately and got him back. This time, if they contact her, we need her to wait to negotiate to demand proof of life. But, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Mrs. Wong is terrified. She may not listen to us. At 4:37 p.m., 20 hours and 7 minutes into the investigation, the phone finally rang. Nina lunged for it. A police officer's hand covered hers, holding her back for 3 rings while recording equipment activated. On the 4th ring, she was allowed to answer. Hello. The voice on the other end was male, speaking Cantonese with a mainland accent. You want to see your husband again? Nina's response was immediate, desperate. Yes, please. Is he alive? Is he hurt? He is alive. For now, we want 60 million Hong Kong dollars. The amount staggered even the experienced negotiators listening. 60 million HKD, approximately 7.7 million US dollars in 1990 dollars, was an unprecedented ransom demand in Hong Kong. The figure was calculated to cause pain even to a billionaire. Vickers, listening on another extension, frantically scribbled notes on a pad, holding them up for Nina to see. Ask for proof. Demand to speak to him. But Nina, overcome with emotion, didn't follow the script. I'll pay. Whatever you want. Just don't hurt him. The line went dead. The team erupted in controlled chaos. Technicians scrambled to trace the call. It had come from a pay phone in Shenzhen, just across the border in mainland China. By the time local police reached the location, it was deserted. Vickers slumped in his chair, head in his hands. 28 kidnapping cases, and he understood what Nina didn't. Her eagerness to pay, her failure to demand proof of life, her emotional reaction. All of these could have just signed her husband's death warrant. Professional kidnappers kept hostages alive because living hostages had value. But if they believed payment would come quickly without proof, without negotiation, the calculus changed. Why maintain the risk and expense of keeping a hostage alive if the money would flow anyway? As evening fell on April 11th, 36 hours into the case, a grim reality settled over the investigation team. They were no longer just racing against time to find Teddy Wong. They were racing against Nina Wong's terror. By midnight, approaching the 48-hour mark, a second call came. This time, the voice was different, speaking Mandarin. They provided wiring instructions for a Taiwan bank account. They demanded the full 60 million Hong Kong dollars be transferred within 72 hours. They offered no proof that Teddy Wong was still alive. Nina, against all advice, began mobilizing her financial resources to pay. As April 12th dawned, Teddy Wong had been missing for 48 hours. The critical window was closing. In Vickers' experience, what happened in the next 24 to 72 hours would determine whether this ended with a joyful reunion or a body recovered from Hong Kong's harbor. The investigation had expanded across borders. Hong Kong police coordinated with authorities in mainland China and Taiwan. The case involved jurisdictions that didn't always cooperate, criminal networks that operated across boundaries that law enforcement couldn't easily cross. And somewhere in that vast geographic and political complexity, Teddy Wong remained hidden, if he was still alive at all. The Taiwan connection opened like a festering wound. Hong Kong police discovered that the ransom account was registered to a shell company in Taipei, linked to individuals with suspected triad affiliations. The kidnapping wasn't the work of opportunistic amateurs. This was an operation involving organized crime syndicates operating across 3 territories: Hong Kong, mainland China, and Taiwan. The complexity was intentional. Each jurisdiction had different laws, different levels of cooperation, different political considerations. The kidnappers had created a maze designed to frustrate investigation while facilitating escape. By April 13th, 3 days after the abduction, Nina Wong had assembled 34 million Hong Kong dollars in cash and negotiable securities. Vickers pleaded with her to slow down, to use the time to pressure the kidnappers, to demand proof that Teddy was alive. But Nina was beyond rational persuasion. Her husband had survived 8 days in captivity in 1983. She couldn't bear the thought of prolonging his suffering by playing negotiation games. "You don't understand," she told Vickers, tears streaming down her face. "He's claustrophobic. They kept him in a refrigerator last time. I have to get him out." The image haunted everyone who heard it. A billionaire property magnate, chained inside a refrigerator, waiting in the dark. On April 14th, investigators received a break. An informant in the Triad underworld reported that the kidnapping had been planned for over 3 years. The gang had studied Wong's routines meticulously, noting his refusal to vary his schedule or employ security despite the 1983 incident. They'd known exactly where he would be, exactly when he would be vulnerable. The informant provided names. One stood out: Lee Wai-kit, a known criminal with connections to both Hong Kong and Taiwan triads. Police began surveillance, but Lee had gone to ground, aware that investigators were closing in. Days blurred into each other. Nina existed in a fugue state of terror and hope, barely eating, sleeping in fitful intervals on a couch in her study so she'd be near the phone. Business associates arrived to offer support but were turned away. The media camped outside grew bolder, their camera lenses peering through the mansion gates like predatory eyes. On April 20th, 10 days after the kidnapping, a package arrived at police headquarters. Inside was a photograph of Teddy Wong. He sat against a nondescript wall, holding a newspaper dated April 18th. His eyes were hollow, his face drawn, but he was unmistakably alive. The image brought Nina to her knees with relief. It also gave investigators critical information. The wall behind Wong appeared to be concrete, possibly a warehouse or storage facility. The newspaper was a Taiwan publication. He was likely being held somewhere in Taiwan, probably in a remote area where screams wouldn't carry. On April 26th, 16 days after the abduction, Nina Wong made her decision. Against all advice from Vickers and his team, she authorized the transfer of 30 million Hong Kong dollars, half the demanded ransom, to the Taiwan account. They'll release him, she insisted. They have to. I'm showing good faith. Vickers knew better. The kidnappers now had half the money and still had full control of the hostage. There was no incentive to release Wong until they'd extracted every possible dollar. The bank transfer completed at 2:47 p.m. on April 26th. Nina returned to her mansion to wait for the call that would tell her where to find her husband. The call never came. Instead, the next morning, April 27th, Taiwan police made a series of dramatic arrests. 6 individuals were taken into custody across Taipei and its surrounding areas. One was later identified as an intelligence officer in Taiwan's security apparatus. Another was a Hong Kong resident with a rap sheet spanning 2 decades. The news should have been cause for celebration. But when Taiwan authorities interrogated the suspects, the truth they revealed was worse than silence. According to multiple suspects, Teddy Wong had never left Hong Kong waters. He'd been held on a sampan, a small Chinese fishing boat, anchored in a secluded bay. The kidnappers had planned to transport him to Taiwan after receiving the full ransom. But on April 13th, just 3 days after the abduction, a Chinese naval vessel had appeared in the area, conducting routine patrols. Panicked that they would be discovered, the kidnappers made a brutal decision. They bound Teddy Wong's hands and feet, tied weights to his body, gagged him, and threw him overboard into the South China Sea. He was 56 years old. He had survived 8 days of captivity in 1983. He had built a business empire from his father's modest paint shop. He had amassed a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And he drowned in cold seawater, weighted down like refuse, approximately 72 hours after his abduction. When Vickers received the confession, he sat in his office for a long moment, staring at the wall. 28 kidnapping cases, 26 successful recoveries, 2 failures, 2 bodies that would haunt him forever. But there was no body to confirm this confession. The South China Sea doesn't easily surrender its dead. Without physical evidence, Wong's status remained technically unresolved. Missing, presumed dead, but not definitively deceased. Nina Wong, when informed of the confession, rejected it entirely. "He's still alive," she insisted. "They're lying. They want to keep the rest of the ransom money. Teddy is out there somewhere, and I'm going to find him." The investigation into Teddy Wong's disappearance became one of Hong Kong's most exhaustive criminal inquiries. Over the next 9 years, police followed thousands of leads across multiple countries. The $30 million Nina had transferred vanished through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, untraceable beyond the initial Taiwan bank. Some of the arrested suspects were convicted on various charges: money laundering, conspiracy, organized crime activities, but the confessions about Wong's death were never definitively proven in court. No body was recovered. No physical evidence emerged from the South China Sea. The case remained open, a wound that wouldn't heal. Nina Wong refused to accept her husband's death. According to her personal assistant of 27 years, Ringo Wong, she continued to receive phone calls purportedly from Teddy well into the year 2000, a full decade after his disappearance. She saw photographs she believed showed him alive. she hired private investigators across Asia. She traveled to remote areas of China, Vietnam, and Guizhou, guided by feng shui masters who claimed to sense her husband's presence. The search took on elements of obsession and delusion. Tony Chan, a feng shui consultant, became Nina's close advisor, telling her what she desperately wanted to hear: that Teddy was alive and could be brought home. They conducted rituals, traveled to temples, burnt incense in locations Chan identified as spiritually significant. Critics saw exploitation of a grieving widow. Nina saw hope. In 1999, 9 years after the kidnapping, Hong Kong's High Court declared Teddy Wong legally dead. The ruling came after closed hearings examining all available evidence: the confessions of the kidnappers, the timeline of events, the $30 million ransom that had vanished, the complete absence of any credible sighting of Wong after April 10, 1990. Justice David Yam ruled that Wong could be presumed to have died on or shortly after April 10, 1990. The legal declaration opened a Pandora's box of inheritance disputes that would consume the next 2 decades. Teddy Wong's father, Wong Din-shin, produced a 1968 will naming himself as sole beneficiary, allegedly written after Teddy discovered Nina's infidelity. Nina countered with a 1990 will, signed just 1 month before Teddy's disappearance, leaving everything to her with the phrase "one life, one love" in English. The battles over Teddy's estate became legendary in Hong Kong legal circles. In 2002, the High Court declared Nina's will a forgery and awarded the estimated $128 million estate to Wong Din-shin. Nina appealed. She lost. She was charged with forgery and released on bail. Then, in 2005, Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal overturned all previous rulings, validating the 1990 will and securing Nina's control of the Chinacham Empire. Nina Wong died in 2007 at age 70, still maintaining that her husband was alive somewhere. She died as Asia's richest woman, worth an estimated $4.2 billion. Her own will was immediately contested by Tony Chan, her feng shui advisor, who produced a document claiming Nina had made him her sole heir and admitted they had been secret lovers. The court ruled Chan's will was forged. Nina's fortune went to a charitable foundation. The forensic accountants, lawyers, and judges who spent decades sorting through the Wong family fortune sometimes lost sight of the central tragedy. A man was taken from his car on a humid Hong Kong evening and never seen again. Steve Vickers, who retired from the Hong Kong police and started a private security consultancy specializing in kidnapping negotiations, still thinks about Teddy Wong. In interviews years later, he maintained his belief that the second kidnapping was always meant to be a murder, disguised as a ransom situation. Everything felt wrong from the start, Vickers reflected. Professional kidnappers want their asset alive. That's basic economics. But this gang demanded an enormous sum, accepted half of it without negotiation, and then nothing. I think Teddy was probably dead within the first 72 hours, possibly sooner. The rest was theater to extract money from Nina. The theory gained credibility when investigators traced the sophisticated planning. The gang had studied Wong for 3 years, knew his routines intimately, coordinated across 3 jurisdictions, involved members with military and intelligence training. This was not a simple kidnapping for ransom. Someone wanted Teddy Wong dead, Vickers said, and they were willing to make millions doing it. Who exactly wanted Wong dead remains speculation. Business rivals, certainly. He had left a trail of unpaid contractors and bitter negotiations across Hong Kong's cutthroat construction industry. Criminal organizations, possibly. The triads were expanding their activities in the late 1980s, and a spectacular kidnapping sent a message about their reach and ruthlessness. Some theorists suggested political motivations, speculating that Wong had connections or information that made him valuable or dangerous to parties interested in Hong Kong's imminent return to Chinese control. The truth drowned in the South China Sea with Teddy Wong. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. No body has ever been recovered. Some of the kidnappers remain at large, presumably living in mainland China or Taiwan, beyond Hong Kong law enforcement's reach. The $30 million Nina paid is still unaccounted for. Magazine Gap Road, where Wang was abducted, looks much the same today. Traffic still flows up toward the peak, carrying Hong Kong's wealthy to their hilltop mansions. The spot where his Mercedes was found abandoned, door hanging open, engine running, is unmarked. There's no plaque, no memorial. But residents of the peak who knew the Wangs say they sometimes think of Teddy on humid evenings like that April night in 1990. They think of how quickly life can be stolen, how thoroughly a person can vanish, how money provides no immunity from violence. The Chinacham Group, now controlled by the charitable foundation Nina established, continues to develop Hong Kong's skyline. Buildings bearing that name stand throughout the city, monuments to the empire Teddy Wang built and never got to see completed. Nina Tower, the ambitious development Nina planned and named as a tribute to Teddy and herself, rises 1,574 feet above the city. It was completed in 2006, 1 year before Nina died and 16 years after Teddy vanished. Ringo Wang, Nina's personal assistant who accompanied her on the desperate searches for Teddy across Asia, believed until Nina's death that some part of her knew the truth. She had known since that April morning when the phone fell silent after the first ransom payment. She had known when the confessions came through. She had known when the court declared him legally dead. But accepting that knowledge would have meant accepting that she'd failed him, that her impulsive payment of half the ransom without demanding proof of life had removed any incentive to keep him alive, that the same terror that drove her to pay so quickly might have accelerated his death. So she clung to the possibility that he lived, that somewhere in the vast expanse of Asia, Teddy Wang wandered with amnesia, or was held by kidnappers who'd forgotten about him, or had chosen to disappear and start a new life. The alternative, that he died in terror, weighted and gagged and thrown into dark water within days of being taken, was unendurable. On April 10, 2025, 35 years will have passed since Teddy Wang's Mercedes slowed on Magazine Gap Road. Anyone involved in the kidnapping who was in their 30s then will be in their late 60s now. The world has moved on. Hong Kong returned to China, survived SARS, weathered political upheaval, and transformed into a city that would be barely recognizable to the Teddy Wang of 1990. But the case endures in Hong Kong's collective memory as a reminder that in the first 48 hours after someone vanishes, everything matters. Every decision, every phone call, every minute of delay or action can mean the difference between life and death. Steve Vickers' rule of thumb from his 28 cases. Patience saves lives more often than panic, even when panic feels like love. Teddy Wang's case proved that rule. In the worst possible way, the South China Sea keeps its secrets. Its depths conceal shipwrecks and aircraft, smugglers' caches and refugees' dreams. Somewhere in those waters, in sediment and current and the endless cycle of marine life, lie whatever remains of Teddy Wang. Perhaps his body washed ashore on some remote beach and was never identified. Perhaps the weights failed and he drifted in currents for months before sinking. Perhaps he was devoured by scavengers within hours of drowning. The ocean doesn't care about billions of dollars or business empires or desperate wives who refuse to stop searching. The last verified sighting of Teddy Wang was at 8:15 p.m. on April 10, 1990, when he waved goodbye to staff at the Royal Hong Kong Jockey Club Gymnasium. Security camera footage shows him walking to his Mercedes, a man at the peak of his success and influence, unaware that he had 15 minutes of freedom remaining. At 8:30 p.m., hands grabbed him on Magazine Gap Road. By midnight, he was already classified as missing. By April 13th, according to the kidnapper's confessions, he was dead. But Nina Wang's phone calls kept coming for 10 years after that, voices claiming to be Teddy, asking for help, providing just enough detail to seem authentic. Were they cruel hoaxes, extortion attempts, or was there some possibility, however remote, that the confessions were false and Teddy Wang did survive? We'll never know with certainty. What we know is this. When someone disappears, the first 48 hours are a crucible where hope battles against time, where decisions made in panic can determine everything, where the difference between a closed case and a cold case can turn on a single phone call. Teddy Wang's story is a reminder that in those critical hours, there are no second chances. The choices made then echo forever, in courtrooms and families and the empty spaces where someone should have been. Magazine Gap Road still climbs toward the peak each night. Cars still drive that route. But now, perhaps, some drivers think twice about their safety, vary their routines, consider the vulnerability of predictability. The Mercedes-Benz that Teddy Wong drove that night was eventually returned to the Wong family. Nina couldn't bear to look at it. It was sold at auction, and the new owner, unaware of its history, drove it for years until it finally wore out and was scrapped. Like everything else in this case, it vanished without a trace. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Silence Between Screams. The Jack Trawick Investigation. The last thing Stephanie Gatch's mother heard before midnight was the sound of her daughter's car pulling into the apartment complex parking lot. A mundane comfort, the reliable rhythm of a Friday night returning to Saturday morning safety. What she did not hear, could not have heard from blocks away, was the moment that rhythm shattered. The footsteps approaching in the darkness, the van door sliding open, the muffled sounds of a young woman's world collapsing into nightmare. By dawn, when worry transformed into frantic phone calls, when friends arrived to find eyeglasses abandoned on pavement like dropped breadcrumbs leading nowhere, the clock had already begun its terrible countdown. In homicide investigations, the first 48 hours are everything. Not because justice has an expiration date, but because killers leave behind pieces of themselves in those early moments, fragments of truth that evaporate like morning fog if not captured immediately. For the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department on that October morning in 1992, the race had already begun, though they didn't yet know they were chasing a predator who had been perfecting his craft for 20 years. The morning of October 10, 1992, arrived with the particular quality of dread that settles over those who know, without confirmation, that something irreversible has occurred. Mary Kate Gatch had spent the night pacing, telephoning, reconstructing her daughter's evening in desperate reverse. Stephanie, 21 years old, a community college student with the kind of radiant smile that photographs seemed designed to capture, had gone shopping at a local mall, routine, ordinary, safe. She should have been home by 10. By midnight, the silence had weight. By 6 a.m., it had texture. By 8, when Rebecca Henderson arrived at Stephanie's apartment at her mother's pleading, it had form. Henderson found the eyeglasses first, Stephanie's distinctive frames lying in the parking space where she always parked, as if she'd been interrupted mid-step between car and door. No struggle marked the pavement. No blood stained the concrete. Just glasses and absence, and the terrible implication of interruption. The missing person report filed that morning carried an urgency the paperwork couldn't quite capture. Young women don't simply vanish between car and apartment. Don't leave behind eyeglasses like shed skin unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. Simultaneously, though the connection wouldn't crystallize for hours, a different discovery was unfolding 3 miles away on Grants Mill Road. The partially clothed body of a young woman, face wrapped in duct tape, throat marked by strangulation, chest pierced by a precise knife wound that had found the heart. The medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Embry, would later testify to the dual cause of death: asphyxiation and cardiac penetration, violence delivered with methodical intent. But in those first hours, she was simply Jane Doe, another statistic, until the missing person report connected 2 tragedies into one investigation. The identification came through fingerprints and the contents of a wallet, or rather, the absence of a wallet, its cards scattered along Alton Road as if the killer had rifled through it while driving, tossing pieces of Stephanie Gatch's identity out a window like unwanted receipts. Jeremy Burns, walking with a friend that Saturday morning, found a Texaco credit card bearing the name Gatch and called police. The search that followed recovered a college identification card and a health insurance card, each piece another confirmation of what everyone already knew. Crime scenes are palimpsests, layered texts where the killer's narrative overlays the victim's final moments, and the investigator's job is archaeological excavation before weather, time, and contamination erase what was written. Lieutenant Stephen Green and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department evidence technicians understood this urgency as they processed Grant's Mill Road with methodical intensity. The duct tape across Stephanie's mouth and nose suggested preparation, premeditation. This was not crime of passion but crime of planning. The location, isolated but accessible, indicated someone familiar with Birmingham's geography. Its hidden spaces where screams wouldn't carry. The knife wound, 3 inches deep, striking the heart with anatomical precision, spoke to either extraordinary luck or terrible practice. The strangulation marks, the blunt force trauma to the head from what investigators would later learn was a hammer. These created a timeline of escalating violence, each act building upon the previous until life extinguished. But what the scene didn't reveal was as important as what it did. No witnesses emerged from the surrounding area. No convenient surveillance cameras captured license plates or faces. The van that Stephanie had been forced into, assuming the initial theory of abduction held, had vanished into Birmingham streets without leaving obvious tire tracks or paint transfer. The killer had been careful, deliberate, and most troublingly, potentially experienced. Gary Harris, the evidence technician, photographed everything, collected everything, documented everything, knowing that defense attorneys years from now would scrutinize every decision made in these crucial hours. The duct tape was bagged for fingerprints. The knife wound was measured and photographed from multiple angles. Stephanie's clothing was carefully preserved for trace evidence analysis. But even perfect evidence collection cannot conjure suspects from thin air. And as hour 24 approached, the department faced the investigator's nightmare. A murdered young woman, grieving family demanding answers, and a suspect pool that encompassed the entire male population of Greater Birmingham. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not through forensic wizardry but through that most valuable and fragile of investigative resources, human fear and human conscience. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department had been investigating a series of attempted abductions in the weeks preceding Stephanie's murder. Reports from multiple women of a man in a van attempting to lure them inside, following them, creating the particular species of terror that women learn to navigate from adolescence onward. One name had surfaced repeatedly in those preliminary interviews: Jack Harrison Trawick, a 45-year-old man with a criminal history that read like a catalog of escalating menace. Burglary, impersonating a police officer, kidnapping, making threatening phone calls, breaking and entering property destruction. Each charge a data point in a pattern of someone testing boundaries, probing defenses, learning the limits of what he could accomplish before consequence arrived. On October 26, 1992, 16 days into the investigation but already years late in the larger context of Trawick's criminal evolution, Lieutenant Green brought him in for questioning. The interview focused initially on the attempted abductions, the stalking complaints, the pattern of predatory behavior. Green approached the Stephanie Gatch murder obliquely, watching for tells, for micro-expressions of guilt or knowledge that might crack the composed exterior Trawick maintained. "Did you have any involvement in Stephanie Gatch's abduction and murder?" Green asked, the question landing in the interview room with the weight of accusation. Trawick deflected, neither confirming nor denying, neither cooperating nor completely refusing. When Green asked about a polygraph examination, Trawick's response was telling: "If I'm either being charged with or, highly suspected of a murder, I need to get legal assistance. Not the protestation of innocence an uninvolved person might offer, but the calculated response of someone understanding the stakes." The interview ended inconclusively. The 48-hour window was closing, and while Trawick remained a person of interest, interest alone doesn't secure search warrants or arrest warrants. The department needed more: a confession, physical evidence, witness testimony that could place him definitively at the scene. And as day 2 ended, they had none of these things. What they didn't know, couldn't have known in those early hours of suspicion and strategic interviewing, was that Jack Trawick was struggling with his own internal calculations. He wanted credit for his work, wanted the death penalty he believed he'd earned through Stephanie's murder and the killing of Aileen Pruitt 4 months earlier. He wanted to ensure this case received capital charges, wanted to guarantee his execution rather than risk life imprisonment where guards might someday become targets. And most unexpectedly, he wanted to control the narrative before investigators pieced together a story without him. The first 48 hours ended with Lieutenant Green filing his reports, documenting the interview, placing Trawick firmly in the investigative crosshairs while knowing they needed more. That more would arrive 72 hours later, when Trawick's mother would call with news that would crack the case open. Her son wanted to talk, wanted to confess, wanted to ensure he'd be tried for capital murder. But in those initial 2 days, the period that homicide investigators universally recognize as critical, the foundation had been laid. The physical evidence had been preserved before degradation could erase it. The victimology had been established. Confirming this was a predator hunting strangers rather than a domestic situation. The suspect had been identified and interviewed, his responses cataloged for later comparison against whatever truth might emerge. And most importantly, the urgency had been established. This wasn't a cold case to be filed away for future review, but an active investigation demanding immediate attention and resources. The first 48 hours don't solve every murder, but they establish the parameters within which all future investigation operates. They capture evidence while it's still available. They interview witnesses while memories remain fresh, rather than reconstructed through months of media coverage and speculation. They signal to suspects that law enforcement is engaged, alert, and closing distance. And in the Trawick investigation, those first 2 days would prove decisive not because they produced immediate arrest, that would take 3 more days, but because they established the infrastructure of evidence and suspicion that would ultimately secure both conviction and execution. On October 29, 1992, 3 days after the initial interview ended inconclusively, Lieutenant Stephen Green received an unexpected phone call that would transform suspicion into certainty. Trawick's mother had contacted the sheriff's department with a message both perplexing and telling. Her son wanted to speak with investigators again, wanted to finish what the previous conversation had started. Green returned to the jail where Trawick was being held on unrelated parole violations, uncertain whether this request signaled cooperation or manipulation. He advised Trawick of his Miranda rights for the second time, watched as the man signed the waiver form with the calm deliberation of someone understanding exactly what he was relinquishing, and waited to hear what confession or deflection might emerge. What Trawick offered was something stranger than simple admission of guilt. He told Green he knew about the Gatch murder, could provide details that would help close the investigation, but these revelations came with conditions that revealed the psychological architecture beneath the crimes. He wanted minimal publicity, ostensibly to spare his mother additional shame. More significantly, he wanted absolute assurance this would be prosecuted as capital murder, that the death penalty would be pursued with full vigor, that his life would end on Alabama's execution gurney rather than stretching into decades of imprisonment. "I want capital," he would later emphasize during the formal confession, interrupting his own narrative when he feared investigators might have grounds only for lesser charges. "Let's stop this right here because we're about to lose the capital part of this case." This wasn't the plea of someone seeking leniency or reduced charges. This was something far more disturbing. A murderer negotiating for his own execution, treating death as an entitlement earned through the brutality of his actions. Green arranged a meeting between Trawick and Deputy District Attorney Roger Brown, understanding that promises about charging decisions couldn't come from investigators but required prosecutorial authority. When that fourth interview commenced on October 29th, the same day as the third, hours separating them, Trawick gave his oral statement, which was audio recorded for preservation and eventual courtroom presentation. The confession was comprehensive and chilling in its detail. Trawick described stalking Stephanie Gatch from the shopping mall to her apartment, patient predation waiting for the moment when she'd be most vulnerable. He detailed approaching her in the parking lot with a toy gun that looked sufficiently real in darkness, forcing her into his van before she could reach her door or scream effectively. He recounted driving to the isolated area on Grants Mill Road, describing the hammer blows to her head, the ligature around her throat tightening until consciousness fled, the knife finding her heart with practitioner's precision. And he confessed to more. Aileen Pruitt, a 27-year-old woman murdered 4 months earlier on June 17, 1992. Her body discovered with over 50 stab and cutting wounds, The coroner's report had documented the excessive violence. The rage or satisfaction that had continued long after death was assured. Trawick admitted this killing too, even mentioning a moment of unexpected emotion when he'd found a photograph of Pruitt's young son in her purse. A flicker of remorse that hadn't stopped his hand but had apparently lodged in memory. Even further back, he confessed to the 1972 murder of Betty Jo Richards, a 17-year-old found stabbed to death in an alley in Quinton, Alabama. Witnesses had seen her screaming as a white man chased her into darkness. Another man had been arrested but never charged, the case going cold for 2 decades until Trawick's confession resurrected it from the archives. He described threatening her at knife point, walking her to the alley, stabbing her more than 10 times in what appeared to be his first confirmed kill. The one that established the pattern, proved to himself what he was capable of, opened the door to everything that followed. The interrogation team listened, recorded, took notes, maintained the professional calm required to prevent any defense claim of coercion or promise-making that might later invalidate the confession. Brown was careful to clarify that he couldn't guarantee capital prosecution until he understood the full circumstances, couldn't promise death until the evidence supported that charge. But Trawick seemed satisfied that his narrative, the kidnapping, the premeditation, the calculated brutality, would meet Alabama's statutory requirements for capital murder. The arrest was formalized that day. The evidence already collected, the duct tape, the forensic documentation, the scattered identification cards, now had context, had a suspect's own words connecting him to the crimes in ways that would be nearly impossible to refute at trial. But confessions, however detailed, are only valuable if they're admissible in court. Defense attorneys would later challenge the voluntariness of Trawick's statements, arguing that his desire for capital punishment and his documented severe mental illness rendered him incapable of making knowing and intelligent waivers of his rights. They would present evidence of his diagnoses dating back to 1970. Paranoid schizophrenia with homicidal impulses, a lifetime of psychiatric treatment, electric shock therapy, desperate requests for medical castration to control sexual dysfunction and violent fantasies, hormone treatments that had caused such physiological changes he'd required a mastectomy in 1982. The courts would ultimately reject these challenges. Judge after judge would rule that wanting the death penalty didn't negate voluntariness, that mental illness didn't automatically preclude understanding one's rights, that Trawick had been lucid and deliberate in his confessions even if his underlying psychology was profoundly disordered. The taped confession would be played for juries in both of his murder trials, his own voice recounting atrocities in sufficient detail that no reasonable doubt could survive. Yet the confession raised questions that transcended its evidentiary value. What kind of person requests their own execution? What internal calculus determines that death by legal injection is preferable to life in prison? Some forensic psychologists would later suggest that Trawick's desire for execution represented the ultimate expression of control. He'd controlled his victims' deaths, and now he sought to control his own, on his terms, with society providing the mechanism he couldn't deploy himself. Others saw something bleaker. A man who understood that his compulsions were uncontrollable, who recognized that as long as he lived, he would fantasize about harming others, and who genuinely believed death was the only reliable constraint on what he might do given opportunity. In a letter to Circuit Judge James Hard after his conviction, Trawick would make this explicit. If sentenced to life rather than death, he threatened he would kill a prison employee. This wasn't bravado but acknowledgement of internal truth. The confession also opened investigative doors that had remained closed. Birmingham police began reviewing cold cases, looking for patterns that matched Trawick's methods. Names emerged. Tony Lim, murdered in March 1990, though DNA would eventually link Stephen Petrick to that crime. Dr. Michelle St. Romain disappeared in June 1991, though convicted kidnapper Michael McNeely would ultimately be charged with her murder. Trawick's claims of additional victims, 14 or 15, he'd hint to correspondence years later, send investigators searching through decades of unsolved disappearances and homicides. Most of these claims proved impossible to corroborate. Trawick provided varying levels of detail, sometimes offering names and locations, sometimes only vague descriptions that could apply to dozens of cases. Prosecutors Laura Petro would later call these additional confessions complete and utter garbage, suggesting Trawick enjoyed inflating his body count, reveling in the attention and fear his claims generated. Only the Betty Jo Richards murder from 1972 appeared credible, the details matching investigative files closely enough that authorities believed his admission. But with Trawick already facing death for the Gatch murder and life without parole for the Pruitt killing, prosecuting that case became unnecessary. Resources were finite, and justice for Richards's family would have to be found in knowing who'd killed their daughter rather than seeing him tried for it. The confession's architecture revealed something essential about Jack Trawick. He wasn't an impulsive killer, wasn't someone whose crimes emerged from rage or passion. He was methodical, controlled, strategic in his predation and in his self-presentation. He'd spent decades refining his approach, learning from close calls and near captures. He'd burgled homes specifically to terrorize attractive women he'd identified, stealing their underwear, leaving lipstick messages on their mirrors, creating fear as carefully as other criminals steal jewelry. He'd impersonated police officers to gain victims' trust. He'd made threatening phone calls informing women their husbands had been injured or killed, preying on their panic. He'd attempted abductions that failed when women fought back or witnesses intervened. Each experience taught him something, refined his methodology, brought him closer to the kind of predation he'd ultimately perfect. And when finally captured, he'd confessed not from guilt or remorse but from pride, from desire for recognition, from insistence that his crimes be categorized at the highest level of severity. The confession wasn't an ending, but a continuation of the control he'd exercised throughout his criminal career. Control over who died, how they died, how their deaths would be remembered, and ultimately how his own death would be administered. The legal proceedings that followed Jack Trawick's confession would unfold over 2 years, 2 separate murder trials that would expose the Birmingham community to the full scope of his violence, while testing the criminal justice system's capacity to handle a defendant who actively sought the harshest punishment possible. Jury selection for the Stephanie Gatch trial began on March 21, 1994, 18 months after her murder. The proceedings occurred in Jefferson County Circuit Court under Judge James Hard, and the atmosphere carried a peculiar tension. Defense attorney William Del Grosso faced an almost impossible task, defending a client who'd confessed in detail, who wanted to be convicted of capital murder, who essentially demanded the death penalty be imposed. Del Grosso's strategy centered on mental illness mitigation rather than disputing guilt. He introduced medical records documenting Trawick's psychiatric history spanning decades, the 1970 diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia with homicidal impulses, the multiple hospitalizations, the treatments that had failed to control his violent fantasies. He called Kathleen Ronan, a psychologist from Taylor Harbert Secure Medical Facility, who testified about the severity and persistence of Trawick's mental health disorders. The defense argued that while Trawick had committed the crimes, his severe mental illness should preclude a death sentence. They presented his history of desperate attempts at self-control. The voluntary chemical castration in 1982 using progestin hormone treatments, the resulting physiological changes that had required a mastectomy, the requests to doctors to castrate him surgically when chemical methods proved insufficient. These weren't actions of someone reveling in his pathology, but someone trying, however unsuccessfully, to contain it. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Laura Petro and later Roger Brown, had a simpler narrative to present. They played the taped confession in its entirety, Trawick's voice describing the stalking, the abduction, the escalating violence. They presented the forensic evidence. Dr. Joseph Embry's testimony about the knife wound to the heart and the strangulation that had caused asphyxiation. They showed photographs of the crime scene, of Stephanie's partially nude body wrapped in duct tape and discarded like refuse. Mary Kate Gatch attended the trial when she could bear it, sitting in the gallery as stranger after stranger described her daughter's final hours. The testimony was clinically precise in the way legal proceedings require, each detail documented and presented without emotional inflation. But the aggregate effect was devastating. Hearing how Stephanie had been followed from the mall, how she'd been forced into the van just steps from safety, how the hammer had struck her head, how breath had been choked from her throat, how the knife had pierced her heart. On March 23, 1994, after just an hour and 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on the charge of capital murder, murder committed during the course of a kidnapping, exactly as Alabama statute defined it. The penalty phase followed, where the same jury would decide whether Trawick should receive death or life without parole. The deliberation on sentencing took longer, the weight of choosing death requiring careful consideration even for someone as clearly dangerous as Trawick. But ultimately, by a vote of 10-2, the jury recommended execution. On May 5, 1994, Judge Hard formally sentenced Trawick to death, accepting the jury's recommendation and ensuring the defendant would get precisely what he'd requested. The second trial for the murder of Aileen Pruitt began on October 23, 1995. This proceeding occurred with Trawick already on death row, already condemned, but prosecutors believed Pruitt's family deserved their day in court, deserved to see justice rendered specifically for her death rather than having it subsumed into the Gatch conviction. Again, the jury heard a taped confession, this one detailing how Trawick had encountered Pruitt, a woman working as a prostitute and struggling with drug addiction. He described the attack with the same disturbing precision he'd used for the Gatch confession, though in this case, the violence had been even more extensive, over 50 stab and cutting wounds, a level of brutality that suggested either rage or experimental curiosity about what bodies could endure. There was one telling detail in the Pruitt confession that distinguished it from his other admissions. Trawick mentioned feeling remorse, however fleeting, when he discovered a photograph of her young son in her purse. He'd seen evidence that this woman was someone's mother, and for a moment, something approaching normal human empathy had flickered. It hadn't stopped him from killing her, hadn't changed the outcome, but he'd remembered it, mentioned it, perhaps needed investigators to know he'd felt something. On October 25, 1995, the jury found Trawick guilty of murder. Because he was already under a death sentence for the Gatch killing, this trial couldn't result in execution. So Judge Hard sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available for non-capital murder. Trawick would serve this sentence concurrently with his death sentence, a legal technicality that recognized he couldn't be executed twice, but ensured his convictions reflected both crimes. The trials had accomplished their legal objectives. Guilt established beyond reasonable doubt, sentences imposed that reflected the severity of the crimes, appeals processes initiated that would eventually consume more than a decade. But they'd also exposed Birmingham to sustained coverage of one of its own residents' transformation into predator, forcing the community to grapple with how someone could live among them for years while harboring such violent compulsions. The question of mental illness versus moral culpability would persist throughout the appeals process. Defense attorneys argued that executing someone as severely mentally ill as Trawick constituted cruel and unusual punishment, that society shouldn't use the death penalty as a treatment for psychosis. They pointed to his documented history of seeking help, of attempting to control his impulses through medical intervention, of recognizing his own dangerousness even if he couldn't prevent the violent acts. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals rejected these arguments in November 1995. The Alabama Supreme Court dismissed a subsequent appeal in February 1997. Years later, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals would turn down another attempt in March 2008. Finally, on November 17, 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, exhausting Trawick's legal options and confirming that his execution could proceed. But between the trials and the final appeals decision, something unexpected occurred that would demonstrate Trawick's capacity for causing harm even from inside a maximum security prison. He began writing letters, creating drawings, corresponding with people outside the prison walls who were fascinated by serial killers and willing to help him reach an audience beyond death row. Death row was supposed to represent containment, the endpoint of Jack Trawick's capacity to harm others. The cells at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, were designed to house condemned prisoners away from general population, to prevent violence and ensure their survival until execution could be carried out. But Trawick discovered that physical incarceration didn't prevent psychological warfare, didn't stop him from terrorizing victims' families, didn't limit his ability to cultivate notoriety. Sometime in the early 2000s, Trawick began corresponding with Neil O'Connor, a New Jersey man who'd become fascinated with the case and who ran a website devoted to death row inmates and serial killers. What started as typical fan mail, disturbing in its own right, but protected under First Amendment principles, evolved into something darker and more deliberate. Trawick began sending O'Connor detailed written accounts of his murders, embellished with the kind of sadistic elaboration designed to shock and horrify. He created drawings depicting mutilated female bodies, artwork that combined technical skill with deeply disturbing content. He wrote about stalking techniques, methods of torture, ways to prolong victim suffering. And crucially, he specifically taunted Mary Kate Gatch by name, addressing letters to her through O'Connor, reminding her that while her daughter was dead, he remained alive and capable of inflicting continued pain. O'Connor posted this material on his website, creating a public repository of Trawick's writings and art that anyone could access. For Mary Kate Gatch, who'd believed the trial's conclusion would bring some measure of closure, the discovery of this website represented a new trauma, a resurrection of grief she'd been trying to process. "I was stunned," she told reporters in 2004. "I could not believe it. I just couldn't believe it." Friends had informed her about the website's existence, sparing her from viewing it directly but ensuring she knew its content. Her daughter's murder recounted in graphic detail, her own name invoked with mockery, her trauma commodified for public consumption. In January 2004, Gatch filed a $45 million lawsuit against both Trawick and O'Connor, alleging emotional distress, invasion of privacy, commercial gain, libel, and obscenity. Her attorney, George Jones, argued that the website crossed the line from protected speech into deliberate infliction of harm. "We believe that the evidence in this case is going to show that in addition to wanting to train people to kill and commit murder and rape, he wants to inflict as much emotional distress on my client as he can." The lawsuit forced a public conversation about inmates' rights versus victims' rights, about where free speech protections end and deliberate cruelty begins. The Alabama Department of Corrections faced criticism for allowing Trawick's letters to leave the prison, though officials argued that First Amendment constraints prevented them from censoring outgoing mail unless it represented an immediate security threat or facilitated ongoing criminal activity. Brian Corbett, the department's public information officer, acknowledged the difficulty. "We don't like this information being posted on the internet more than anyone else does. It's horrific. It's filthy. It has no place being out there. We support Miss Gatch, and we want to see this removed as well as anyone else does. But removing content from the internet once posted proved nearly impossible. Even after O'Connor removed some material under legal pressure, copies circulated elsewhere, preserved by collectors and curiosity seekers. The controversy prompted legislative action. In 2009, as Trawick's execution date approached, Alabama State Senator Zeb Little and Representative Cam Ward sponsored a bill prohibiting death row inmates from profiting from sales of their artwork or writings about their crimes. The legislation specified that any proceeds from such sales should be redirected to victims and their families. Mary Kate Gatch expressed support for the measure, though she noted it came far too late to prevent the harm already inflicted. Beyond the legal and legislative responses, the website incident revealed something essential about Trawick's psychology and the limitations of physical incarceration. He'd spent his entire criminal career seeking control over women's fear, over their bodies, over the moment and manner of their deaths. When prison walls prevented physical predation, he simply adapted, finding new ways to exert control over the narratives of his crimes and the emotional states of survivors. The letters to Stephanie Gatch's mother weren't random cruelty but strategic terror. By ensuring she knew he was still thinking about her daughter, still reliving the murder, still capable of causing pain, he maintained a connection to his crimes that death row was supposed to sever. He couldn't kill again, but he could make survivors relive their losses, could insert himself into their ongoing grief, could demonstrate that his power extended beyond the physical acts of violence into the psychological aftermath. This pattern wasn't unique to Trawick. Across the United States, death row inmates had discovered the internet as a platform, using correspondence and websites to share their stories, sell memorabilia, even attract romantic partners through prison pen pal services. The practice tormented families like the Gatches, who wanted to believe that conviction and sentencing represented the end of their interaction with their loved one's killers. Nancy Rua, executive director of Parents of Murdered Children, noted the widespread nature of the problem. It's going on all over. Victims' families found themselves in an impossible position, unable to prevent the speech because of constitutional protections, unable to avoid learning about it because well-meaning friends and family would inform them, unable to escape the renewed trauma each new posting created. For the Gatch and Pruitt families, the years between Trawick's convictions and his eventual execution stretched interminably. Joshua Pruitt, Eileen's son, had been just a child when his mother was murdered. By the time execution was scheduled for June 11, 2009, he was an adult who'd grown up with the knowledge that the man who'd killed his mother was still alive, still writing, still finding ways to inflict harm. As the execution date approached, Trawick made final dispositions of his property, including plans to give his personal effects, a Bible, dictionary, wallet, television, photographs, and cosmetics, to Todd Bohannon, an internet auctioneer who specialized in serial killer memorabilia. This decision so disturbed Mary Kate Gatch that she chose not to attend the execution, unable to witness an event that would somehow further commodify her daughter's murder. The execution itself, when it finally occurred on June 11, 2009, was witnessed by Stephanie Gatch's sister Heather and Aileen Pruitt's sister Donna Middlebrooks. Trawick used his final statement to offer an apology that carried all the weight of too late recognition. "I wish to apologize to the people whom I have hurt, and I ask for their forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I do ask for it." The lethal injection was administered at 6:17 p.m. It was Alabama's fifth execution that year, the 196th since 1927, the 43rd since the resumption of executions in 1983. For the families who'd waited 17 years since the murders for this resolution, the execution represented not closure. Grief doesn't have neat endpoints, but at least finality. Trawick could write no more letters, create no more drawings, inflict no new pain beyond what he'd already accomplished. The case left behind questions that transcended its individual horrors. How should society handle defendants who demand their own execution? What responsibility do we bear for monitoring death row inmates' communications when those communications victimize survivors? Where is the line between constitutional rights and deliberate cruelty? And perhaps most troubling, how many other Jack Trawicks are learning their craft right now, perfecting their methods, moving toward inevitable violence that could be prevented if only we knew who they were and what they were capable of? The first 48 hours of the investigation had been crucial, establishing the foundation for everything that followed. But the full arc of the case demonstrated that homicide investigations don't end with arrest or conviction or even execution. They echo through families and communities for generations, reshaping how survivors understand safety and trust, how society calibrates justice and punishment, how we recognize that some wounds never fully heal but must simply be endured. In the end, Stephanie Gatch's glasses remained the most poignant piece of evidence, not because they solved the case, but because they represented the moment of interruption, the instant when an ordinary Friday night shopping trip transformed into nightmare. They lay on the pavement where she'd been forced to abandon them, a small detail that captured the enormous violence of what had followed, and they reminded everyone who saw them that behind every homicide statistic is a person who'd been planning to walk safely to their door, to call their mother in the morning, to continue the mundane routines that constitute a life before someone decided to end it. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.